Last week, we talked to Brandon Wamba about his personal journey out of MARSOC to T-Rex and his testimony. And today, we're going to take that exact same topic. We're going to open it up to the wider culture, gun culture, and veterans in general with a good friend of mine. Welcome back to another episode of T-Rex Talk. And today my guest is a friend of mine. Forrest Cooper is the host of a podcast called Redacted. And you have some other things in your resume. So can you just run through those things for the folks who are listening, the T-Rex audience?
Yeah, I'll preface it with the resume is always context, not qualifications. So the short history of where I've been for the last 15 years is homeschooled as a kid, Ranger Battalion right out of high school, went into the Army, went over into 375 or 3rd Ranger Battalion. I was there for just shy of 5 years. That ended up being 4 deployments and team leader time. And for those who know about and are familiar with kind of the structure of Ranger Battalion, a very classic one enlistment time, and that was around the 2009, 10, 12, 13 kind of time frame. That I've worked, other than there, after I left the military, I've worked in the private contracting space, which is also a lot of kind of if you know conversations. And then after a while, I decided to leave all that behind, go to school, and got a degree in philosophy and a degree in theology with a minor in history. And so I found out that I not only enjoyed academia, but it was something that I was fairly decent at. But as things would change, I would get back into it. And so I've worked in various security, contracting, traveling kind of environments. I've been an editor for a very, very large magazine in the firearms industry, and now I am independent and independently trying to figure out who I am and what we're all doing here. So if that sounds a little too scripted.
It's a good thing you have that philosophy degree for figuring out who you are. Very, very handy, I'm told.
Yeah, right. So that is actually that, and that is you've been on the show. You've been on our Redacted Culture Cast, and the interest in philosophy, particularly, is not that type of philosophy that you get from your annoying liberal arts teacher who's like, "Well, the world is anything we want it to be," and postmodernism is just perception is reality. No. The study of philosophy has been around for thousands of years. It is more closer to a science and less of an art. And I think in our world that we live in, and then some of the topics that we're going to talk about, that it actually does provide some of the ancient answers to contemporary problems. Like, why did the collapse of Afghanistan go so poorly? Where do we encounter moral injury and things like PTSD? And what does a collapse of identity look like? And so while I jokingly ask about who I am, the short answer is I've got a lot of irons in the fire, and one of them that I find most important for our industry and culture is philosophy. So there you go.
I appreciate the clarification. I mean, I kind of set you up for it. I don't, as you know, we talked before, I don't appreciate the navel-gazing style of philosophy. And guys who have been deployed in dangerous, unforgiving places about, say, 10, 12 years ago, tend to understand that reality is a pretty unforgiving place that can't be anything that you want it to be. And that is probably a great place to start thinking philosophically. But as you mentioned before, I've been on your show, and I think that when I've been on your show, I've asked more questions about you than you have asked me. So now that you're on the T-Rex show, I'm going to hand it over to you to propose a topic, because I think that's only fair.
Well, see, we can go one of two directions. We could go straight into politics and piss everybody off and get all that blood and urgency rolling. Or I think what I think is intriguing to look at where we're at in a timeline would be the end of the secular age and where this sense of urgency continuously comes from in our country or in our world, and why or how mindset is such a trendy word that is really just robbing from ancient wisdom. So,
well, I'm certainly not wanting to shy away from politics that annoys everybody, but let's ease into it a little bit. Let's talk about some of the post-secular world stuff, some of the the different things that you are seeing, both in Ranger Battalion, the homeschooling world, Ranger Battalion, and academia, and then just the world around you, friends
Yeah.
and neighbors, all of your different inputs.
So one thing I'm starting to see hit almost the mainstream level is this combination of shock and inspiration coming from what looks like a Christian revival within not only the gun culture and certain types of military people, but also amongst what we might say is the red blood of the society is probably the best way I can phrase it. So an
The blue
example of
collar, red blooded guys. Yes. Yeah.
that, yeah, or even more. Like there's big names like Tucker Carlson, Sean Ryan. There's larger characters like Russell Brand even talking about it. Now there's in my microcosm, in my small world, I grew up in Ranger Battalion at the time where the kind of new atheist was the thing. And new atheism, if you can think back 20 years ago, maybe 15 now, well, really 20 years ago, in the early 2000s, kind of starting my observation in the 1900s, late 1990s into the early 2000s, was that brash, bold, arrogant man who's like, there is no God. And he would argue passionately about how religion is stupid and it's the opiate for the masses. And so that kind of mentality was a common paradigm even in the military space, or let's call it the war fighters, right? Whether it's Army, Air Force, Navy, whatever, is very common, especially in the JSOC world, of this kind of bitter, not even stoic, but this bitter, cynical worldview towards what we were doing around the world, or what was going on. And then that worldview, a lot of those men now are changing. In fact, whether they're conversations I'm having privately or things that we're seeing very publicly, again, with people like Slade, who was over in the SEALs, or another one being, I mentioned earlier, Sean Ryan. And then you cross that across the platform. It's like there's this return to faith, not exclusive, but particularly around men who are interested or have a need, maybe inherent desire for a sense of meaning and purpose and direction and value, that there is right and wrong, and it doesn't. There's more evidence for there to being right and wrong than there is to the contrary, and so that is a topic that when we talk about secularism, I don't want to talk about secularism as the lack of belief, but rather secularism as this idea that belief is just one option amongst many that you can take off and put on like a t-shirt. So.
Yeah, and even some of those new atheists, like I'm thinking of Richard Dawkins in particular. He was probably chief amongst the four horsemen of the new atheists back in the 90s and the turn of the century. And even he has recanted a little bit. Like when times are good, it's very easy to be scornful and, very smug about atheism. But recently he's come, to a point of, I don't know if I would call it timidity, but he's looking at Europe sort of crumbling around him and he's saying, you know what, I actually like Christmas and I like the old Christmas carols and I actually kind of, culturally, I guess I am a Christian, I suppose. It's a pretty wide trend in some ways.
Yeah, it's always fun to be a revolutionary until you need to pay the piper. I mean, you chop down you take this idea, not necessarily from Nietzsche himself, but you can take Nietzsche's idea of killing God and removing it from a society, and then you will pay the debt for what you have done. Like let's take a very simple example in America right now, is that same generation of men who were the war fighters who fought in the GWAT. Like I've spent years in Afghanistan, and I actually kind of miss the war more than anything else. But the point with that is you take that entire generation of people, of men that fought the GWAT, and they're one of the highest statistics for suicidality. There would it's you and me. It's men in their 20s, 30s, and 40s is the mass statistic of suicide. Add veteran to that, more reasons for it. And you think, well, people join the military because they want to have a sense of purpose and direction. Well, that there might be something there to be true. Then why are we killing ourselves? If 6,000,
Yeah.
if we lost roughly 6,000 people in the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq, it's roughly 6 to 7, kind of in that range. And when I know that's a bit of a crass, there's a lot of room for people to fit in that one. The conservative number for veterans who've committed suicide in that time period is at least tenfold, 60,000. So yeah, we're not really worried about getting blown up overseas, because what's much more likely is that we're going to lose all hope on this side of the ocean and do it ourselves, and that's where philosophy comes in. So.
Yeah, and when you go, we just what is it? It's the end of September, and early on in September 11, everybody posts about never forgetting, and I was just remembering how long ago September 11 was. But all of the guys who are my age or just a teeny bit younger that signed up because of 9/11 went in to do a specific job, and that job was making the world safer from terrorists like that did that, or maybe it was revenge or something like that. But there was this idea that we're gonna go into these terrible parts of the world and we're gonna make a difference. And we were told that if we could just get people enough ballots, they would vote themselves into utopian democracy. And after 20 years of being in Afghanistan, like how much beneficent utopian democracy did you see? And then also we just suddenly left. So I can understand, and my heart bleeds for guys who attach themselves to a cause that was a bad pitch and then also got dropped as soon as we were tired of it. Like that just cuts the purpose right out of you, especially if you've dedicated years of your life in miserable circumstances and have brought home permanent scars from it. Yeah, it's brutal.
So I wonder how many men, if you ask them who went to war during the GWAT, post 9/11, were alive. They were alive when it happened. I wonder how many men you would ask if you asked them why they joined the military. I wonder how many of them would answer that it had to do with some sort of geopolitical answer or some sort of cultural, like again, revenge for 9/11 kind of thing. The time that I was in,
it'd be interesting to get into that. Yeah.
Well, and I think you'd find a couple of things. One of them is the further away from 9/11 yet you get, the more likely I think you're gonna have a higher likelihood of people having a different answer. But then also you have to get away from sort of the recruiter's answer mentality. Because I remember sitting in basic training and like the drill sergeant's asking, "Why'd you join the army?" And you're like, "Oh, I wanted to fight people," or whatever. It's like that question has remained with a lot of us, and I think the answer is perhaps some people joined out of a sense of adventure. Some people joined out of an economic motivation. There's a conglomeration. I wonder how many of them would say, if you ask them, that the idea of going to war was better than living in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think for some people, again, 1911, there's a revenge element. But I think for some people, myself, so I am 43. So I was, not 18, 19 when September 11 happened. But I can't do the math right now because it's too late at night. But I had contemplated a military career prior when I was, 16, 17, 18. And Cold War was over. Gulf War was over. It seemed like nothing was going to happen and nothing was ever going to happen. And so that was a lot less appealing to me to go, fly a desk somewhere and then follow the chain up into some sort of boring Pentagon assignment or whatever. I assumed that I would rise very high into just the worst Pentagon job ever. That was much less appealing to me than like, oh, we just lost a whole bunch of people in a terrorist attack. It is Pearl Harbor. Like stuff's happening again. Like the age, reality is back and war is back, and I have a chance at a warrior culture where previously I could have been doing, reminding people to wear their safety belts and doing guard duty at some place in Virginia. I think that for some folks that was the thing where it was like, there's actually some manly masculine purpose where I can do more than just PT and mandatory fun day stuff.
I was talking to a man would be of what you'd refer to my alma mater, who's coming from the Ranger Battalion, and not too long ago. And he referred to the time that I was in as the golden years, which is funny because I think I think there's this. It's not that I think. It's like one of those things that everybody knows, but nobody really states as openly, is that being in the military, you have a genuine fear of missing out. There is a certain sort of FOMO because you don't actually get to choose all the gunfights that you're in. You don't get to choose the battles that you fight all the time. Sometimes they are decided by officers that you will never meet in your life, and sometimes they are decided by the enemy, who you do not have any. You don't get to determine their movement in the same way. So being, like when somebody comes home from a deployment and it's a good deployment, they got a lot, they worked a lot, they were in a number of gunfights, they were successful. There's a sense of jealousy that goes around. But
yeah,
now
it
extrapolate
is
that
interesting
in the timeline.
Yeah. So we go from, different reasons that you would go to war. So you would go to war because your country is under attack to defend your way of life. There's a little bit of that at the beginning of 9/11. Then you go to war because being a warrior is something that you feel like is in your blood and in your soul, but you don't want to go to just join the army. You want to go to be a warrior and actually see war, combat, be there for the guy next to you, actually engage the enemy. Or maybe you go there because you really do truly believe that the way that nation building works is we go over there and we drone strike a bunch of people until they vote enough trans people into the Taliban leadership that utopia appears, something like that. Some US State Department line. That's kind of an interesting spectrum. How many people did you meet in your time who really believed that the State Department, the gospel of the State Department was really going to renew Afghanistan?
I don't think that most of the people that I was in the military with during my time had any idea what the goal was in any sort of.
Too.
And I don't think, I'm not saying that is a discredit of them. Rather, it's
right.
that at that time, and there are maybe you could look at like the Washington Times article, or was it the Washington Post, whatever, about how after a certain point there really wasn't a plan for Afghanistan. Or if you read a book like Jawbreaker, which is given, let's see, what's the author's name? I have it here. He's the CIA guy who headed up the initial hunt for bin Laden. It's Gary Bernstein. And you see that there's the early motivation in Afghanistan was to go find bin Laden, but like nation building nation building is an interesting problem because it can be an economic issue, it can be an ethics issue, it's a political issue, it is a legal systems issue, which all of those things are going to stem from a question of what you think is right and true and good, and why
culture and religion. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so yeah, I think going back to your question, if you ask the people who joined the military around the time that I did, I think most of them would be more looking at the military as some form of rite of passage, much more than they were looking at the military as some sort of strategic development to fix another nation's problems and limit terrorism in the world. There were examples of those being minor motivations, but I think the major motivation, if you look at the individuals on a person-to-person basis, was a rite of passage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and the guys that were in before, the guys that I knew when I was young who had come back, they'd come back from Bosnia, they'd come back from peacekeeping missions, famine relief, UN stuff, and it just sounded terrible. Like, you're helping people that don't want to be helped with stuff that they don't want, inside of what is, so some of the different famines in Somalia and other places are obviously manufactured. It's not that there's a lack of food, it's that there's local warlords controlling the food and starving their enemies and things like that. So UN peacekeepers go in there, American soldiers go in there, guard the trucks, drive them around, and they're like, but we're not allowed to take out the warlords. We're not allowed to solve the problem. We're just allowed to deliver rice to the people who were powerless to stop the warlords. But then all they do is turn around and just screw their neighbors over because they have access to the food now. Like, they don't want us here. They don't want the UN rice. This is the worst. Mm-hmm. It was so demoralizing for some of the people that I talked to that were doing that kind of peacekeeping stuff. At what point did the Afghanistan mission go from we're beating the Taliban, we're finding bin Laden, we're actually making some headway to we don't know why we're here, we don't know what the plan is, and we don't know how long this is going to take because we don't know where we're going. Like, do you know when that kind of changed time frame wise?
There's going to be. I wish I could have a short answer on this one, and that's not really what I'm known for anyway. So whatever, right? Let's look at one layer, one level would be like the officer corps. You could say that there's a pretty solid difference in plan and activity and direction between the Bush administration to the Obama administration to the Trump administration to then the Biden administration. So there's a political issue with that.
We can call it the Biden administration. His name was on it, so we'll call it that. Yeah.
Biden.tm, right? So whatever his brand is today. But my point on that one is, I don't. This is the unsatisfactory answer. One, I don't know, but two, my gut says long before the war started. I think long before we even went to war in Afghanistan, I think that we never really established any meaningful direction for what was to be accomplished there,
right?
Because we have spent the West has spent the last 100 years chopping out the roots of all of its systems, all of its beliefs when it comes to what is morality, what is the basis of the family unit, what is the structure of our society, why is voting even important? You can't ask a person on the street today why democracy matters. Why does your opinion about who should run for the government ever matter at all? You're barely literate. So, you know what I mean? Like, or what does literacy have to do with legitimacy for government? This is not the first time that we've experienced crises like this, especially in Western countries. It's just the Afghanistan war. You might want to, like, what layer of analysis? The generals probably lost it in 2008, to maybe certainly after we killed Osama bin Laden, but that was in 11, and then not long after that. I mean, okay, when Halliburton stopped making money, there's just going to be an infinite number of questions. The other question is, why didn't we just colonize Afghanistan and turn it into Puerto Rico or something like that? That would be another morally dubious question. And then you have to answer.
Sure.
So I apologize. I think I've been derailing the question more than solving it.
Oh, no. Well, no. I assumed that the answer was going to be, there is no answer. It was different for different people. There were probably young CIA guys who were like, yeah, just get in there. We'll get in there. We'll find the guys. We'll kill them. That's what we're good at. That's going to solve the problem. And then there were probably the mighty old Tuskers of the CIA who were like, nah, we went to Afghanistan and we helped them fight the Soviets. And we realized that, Afghanistan's never going to change. If Alexander the Great couldn't do it, everything's gone exactly the same way every time anyone's tried this.
Yeah. Or maybe a question of like, what is the strategic value of a war in Afghanistan? And one of them might be crippling various other forces at work. I mean, that sounds really ambiguous, but like,
yeah,
if we hold Afghanistan, let's drop Afghanistan and we look at something like Ukraine. There's a lot of politics to the conversation of Ukraine. There's a lot of politics on who's getting whose money and where's it going and whatever. There's a lot of politics to be about Russia being represented one way or another and who's to benefit. And if Ukraine and Afghanistan can be compared in a similar case, neither country holds a immense amount of, let's call it, economic value. I mean, Ukraine is a bit of a breadbasket. Afghanistan has a lot of lithium. They're not the only places where food can be grown or battery components can be achieved. They have a strategic value that they exist in parts of the world that are, well, Afghanistan's a little bit more difficult to inhabit, but the strategic value of having assets there is now you're closer to Cold War enemies and potential new enemies with that in China. So
yeah.
So like the in the short term question, why are we in Afghanistan is a really hard question for many people to answer, but can it? I think it can be answered on multiple levels. It's just one of them might be very uncomfortable, and that is globalism. Not globalism as in like the globalists and Alex Jones, but we're talking about globalism as in the shrinking of the earth through the interconnectivity of logistics and transportation and communication, means that war is now perpetual. Congratulations. You went from the internet.com to Warhammer 40K. You just don't have space racists or whatever it is. So,
Oh, we have the races. We just don't have the astronaut part. We have all the worst parts of Warhammer 40K. None of the cool bits.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things, and I have derailed you completely from talking about the resurgence of Christianity and a cultural change that is happening. In some ways, that I feel like that's kind of what we have done in Ukraine and have done in Afghanistan. And nobody really said this out loud publicly, but it was like, you know what? The boogeyman right now is terrorists. And if we go start a war in Afghanistan, all the terrorists will come to Afghanistan. That'll be a great place for us to fight them. And now it's like the boogeyman is Russia. So we just have to keep the boogeyman really busy in a place that's not here. So it's kind of like Operation Provide Targets, and just provide enough money that we bleed the boogeyman dry. And I mean, for a while, that was absolutely happening. Like, people were coming from Syria, Libya, people were coming from all around the world to fight the Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was, in many ways, it was a lot comfier for Americans living at home to have that conflict someplace else.
Yeah.
But I, in the same way that we've derailed some of those things, it kind of derailed your question. Now that people have come back from these different conflicts where nobody can agree on what the goal was, which means nobody can agree on what success was. If you can't agree on what success was, you definitely failed. And so I think that there is a level of seeking a different philosophical foundation, because the last one was undefinable, but undeniably failed.
So this is where I think the timeline is important. And while it may sound like we're derailing, this all comes back full circle. And one place where it does is those generations of men that were raised on rah-rah patriotism and then beaten to the ground by the pseudo-feminists who are now doing the transgenderism thing. And now they're saying the very same people who told you can believe whatever you want to believe so long as you don't hurt anybody else are now saying, trans the child bigot. I think those men, particularly those men who went to the military, and the people who have that same martial spirit, and those people who are looking for some sense of values and morals, are realizing that perhaps it wasn't just that we had no goal, but that was part of the objective all along, and that we, in some sense, are the bad guys of the story, or we have been playing a game by the bad guys of the story. And so, and that what is a little bit more hard to stomach is that I participated willingly, and now I have hard work to do, and that is to not necessarily right the wrongs, because that's a little bit too ambiguous, but rather it's that this lie that I got sold was, or the lie that our culture has been believing, is that you can believe whatever you want to believe, not only isn't working, but its end is actually suicide. And so you have these men and women who have kind of come to the end of the road of that new atheism. They've followed it to its logical conclusion, which is you're going to either have to stop being alive because there's no point, or this isn't true. And this isn't true is the pathway at that fork is faith or suicide. There's two options. You either have death, or death, and not just a heroic death, but it was all for naught, or maybe that system not only doesn't work, but is wrong. It is factually wrong, morally wrong, and it lacks the capability of self-sustaining. So that's why I think that you're seeing this big resurgence of faith within people within America, specifically men in America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is an element, and it happened. It's been happening over time, but I think that people saw it pretty clearly in 2020, the lockdowns in 2020. Just the people who were the experts proved themselves to be untrustworthy in a way that it hadn't been obvious before. Like, the masks kind of came off of a lot of things in 2020. People were forced to confront some unpleasant truths in 2020. Now, I kind of remember a It's not the entire gun industry, but I remember the gun industry in general kind of taking a little bit of a detour from atheism to faith into like neo-paganism and cool Viking stuff. And then
Mm-hmm.
that kind of has, I see that not really being a thing anymore.
The
But is
neo-paganism?
that well, I mean, the hardcore neo-pagans are still out there, but I no longer see people being like, oh yes, Thor and Odin are the new gods
You mean
that
you mean
SOCOM
you mean
obeys.
you mean it's not still cool to say Till Valhalla, brother? You know, like Till
You
Valhalla,
know,
brother. Be
I'm
a good.
curious to know what how that ended. Was it when people actually heard each other saying that, or was it actually Marvel that made Thor not be cool anymore?
Hmm. Well, I think there's. Let's take a couple things. If it's a very personal matter. I think it was Jack Donovan who was talking about something like, do you ever unironically refer to somebody, one of your friends, as brother? And the answer is either in great mockery or extreme moments of private sincerity. Like, I don't go to him like, hell yeah, brother. He's like, no, none, we don't really talk like that. It's really out of it's out of the norm. I mean, that was kind of an 80s over exaggeration. Fine. But I think what happened with the neo-paganism is, again, the only way that people can really believe in it is with that form of, under that veil, that meta belief system of secularism. Now, there's a good book that people can read on this one, which is called "How Not to Be Secular" by James K. A. Smith, that reduces or shortens a very large book called "The Secular Age," written by Charles Taylor. And Charles Taylor writes a 900-page book, and K. A. Smith turns it into about a 180-page book. It's a really good one to read, particularly because it talks about the mechanism of belief. Once again, we're looking at philosophy here not as a kind of artistic expression of the world, but on how the way that we hold ideas and the way that we think about belief and morality and objectivity has dire consequences on our lives. And once again, if you're going to even take this from a Darwinist perspective, where your purpose is to live and produce your gene seed, or whatever the term is now, if your moral system and your worldview predicates that suicide is the best outcome, then it's probably not an effective worldview. Then it would lose in the game of Darwinism. But that's a bit of a hypersimplification. And so why I brought up that book and this idea of secularism is that secularism in its third form that Charles Taylor's talking about, which is what he's referring to as the secular age, which is the time that we grew up in and are kind of witnessing its collapse, is a time where the primary paradigm, and a paradigm is a term that was popularized by a philosopher in the 1960s named Thomas Kuhn. This is where you get the phrase paradigm shift. A paradigm is a series of assumptions that are generally assumed amongst a study. It's kind of a bad way of introducing it. But the paradigm is sort of think of them as like the things that you expect everyone to know when the common sense that everyone should know when they get out of like high school or something like that. It's just the commonly held beliefs about a certain thing. And secularism in this form addresses the mechanism of belief. The thing that considers a belief valid is authenticity. It doesn't matter whether what you believe is right or true. It's not whether it correlates to reality or not, but rather that you authentically believe it, which makes it a true belief. That is the predicate of, or that is one of the foundations of the paradigm of the secular age. And that worldview, as we call it, results in, well, you can be a neo-pagan without actually thinking there's a dude in the sky with a hammer. Because, or there's a, or it also kind of opens up into some of the dangers of the Jordan Peterson direction, where this is just all kind of a nice explanation of something. No, rather, so paganism, the neo-paganism, doesn't really have any ground to stand on, because from a metaphysics foundation, it's like your ancient text, which Dawkins is another one to be accused of for this. Your ancient text that explains the reality of the world and morality and everything that is real and right and true and good is no different than a comic book. So, of course, it's not going to last. It's just a really nice aesthetic for a while, which is the primary feature of the secular age. Virtue signaling, and being a neo-pagan are just expressing yourself through your pseudo belief system.
I like that point that's made about authenticity. Now, I would say, as a Christian, you need to believe in the actual truth, what is actually true. Authenticity is a different thing. But authenticity is really interesting because our society has, you need to virtue signal, like you need to demonstrate that you agree with the in crowd. You need to demonstrate that you are good with these beliefs. So there's an awful lot of kowtowing or expressing belief in the beliefs. And there's a lot of pressure. Again, a lot of it's more obvious post 2020. Like, you will have benefit if you give the pinch of incense to Caesar. You will have benefit if you agree that transing kids is good. And there's a lot of people who are like, oh, yeah, absolutely. I want to be polite. And I did do all this sensitivity training at my job. And yes, I will get in trouble with HR if I don't do the thing. So yeah, I'll absolutely say the thing, and I'll change my avatar on Twitter to be the flag of the month. Like, I'll do all of these things. But they know that that's not an authentic belief. Like, this is part of the reason that I think a lot of people's worlds are forcing them to search for other things, is they've been asked to believe a lot of things that they know aren't true. And they've stated them, but they know that there's no authenticity there. Now, there's true believers out there for sure. There's also a ton of people who have been told by HR that they'll be in a bunch of trouble if they don't say that they believe X, Y, and Z.
Yeah,
And there's zero authenticity behind the statement.
Yeah, so let's take this example of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Why were the Christians persecuted so much? There's a certain series of questions that might be asked about early Christian persecution during the Roman era. And I think I'll make a prediction and say what the Christians experienced in the early church era during the Roman Empire is what the church in America is going to experience probably within the next 10, 15 years. And because they're already doing it now, they're just using different methods. And the example of it is when the Christians in the early church period, we're talking right after Jesus, so 180 into 280, when they were approached by the Romans and told that they needed to pay homage to Caesar, what the Romans were requiring is that the Christians acknowledged that the absolute law, or the Christians acknowledged that Rome, the state, Caesar, had authority over morality. What Caesar said was essentially God. And so the Christians said, no, we'll follow your laws. We will just not worship your state as if it was God. You are not the arbiter of reality. Where we see that same, I need to kind of simplify that again, but where we see that happening in our day and age is we're seeing it in the language around the transgenderism movement. The transgenderism movement is based on a series of books that are written by philosophers in the 1960s and earlier. And it's interesting because people like James Lindsay have traced it, even though James Lindsay is not a publicly confessing Christian. And he has done a really good job illustrating how it mimics or mirrors very religious structures. And I'll argue that you can't get away from a religious structure because it's inherent to who we are. You cannot not be religious. But let me digress. So one of the examples is the definition of being quote unquote queer is to have an identity without an essence, which to most people sounds like kind of gobbledygook language. It just sounds like a kid using words that they don't really understand. But unfortunately, that's not true. Maybe the person speaking doesn't know what they're saying. Maybe they're just repeat the line. Okay, repeat the line. And that's the level of their cognition. Fine, so be it. But the issue that you're dealing with is the phrase identity without an essence is actually a very important phrase because we as human beings get our identity from what? Well, the technical function of an essence is to give something its identity. It's kind of an important thing. In Christianity, we say imago Dei. We are created in the image of God. It is the breath of life which makes us me. So an identity without an essence is a self-sufficient identity because we as created peoples require something to give us identity. That might be And that is our essence. It's one part our blood, our genetics, our components, one part something else. You got soul, spirit questions there. But to be an identity without an essence is to be a self-sufficient identity. So when somebody says they're queer, they're saying, I am God. And instead of using the words worship me, they say affirm me. To affirm them is no different than worshiping somebody as God. And it is an extremely useful tool for the worship of the state, which is the next step. And that's why you see it completely lockstep in government abuses. I think.
Yeah. And when you have people that are just paying lip service to this thing, that can be really destructive, because now they're affirming things, they're worshiping things, they're pledging their troth, or they're swearing an oath, or they're doing something to something they don't really believe in. So those people are blown about, and it's part of the reason that Rome fell apart. Rome didn't fall apart because there were die-hard Romans that took their worship of Caesar too seriously. Like, that was not actually what caused the fall of Rome. When you have people that have these affirmations without substance and without a foundation, that believe in postmodernism, which just denies the possibility of a foundation when you really boil it down to what the logical end result of that would be. There can't be a foundation if every possible reality is actually true. If the multiverse is actually real, like I saw in a Marvel movie, then there can't be a foundation for anything. And I can affirm this, and I can do this, and I can say that, and I can promise this and swear this so that I don't get fired, or so that I do get this promotion, or so that, so-and-so will do this with me. And that's the kind of thing that results in people who are blown about by every wind of doctrine. And at some point, you realize that that's happening to you. And one of the things that's interesting is, I think, if you look back at America's Christian past and heritage, when people were serious believers, and then over time people sort of fell away, but there was still all of this flavor of Christianity, and there was all this cultural inertia. And so there would be people who could utterly, and Richard Dawkins, I think, is an example of this, who could say, I utterly hate the Christianity, root and branch, but boy, do I love the shade of the leaves, and boy, do I love the apples, which have nothing to do with the root and branch that I hate. And you can only say that while the inertia or the momentum or all of the fruit is still coming from the past. But eventually you realize that you're just out in the wind, and you still hate the root, but you really wish the trunk and the branches were still there, because now you can kind of see that's sort of where the fruit was coming from.
Yeah, the best time to be a communist is right before the revolution, because from there everything goes downhill. So it's it's great to be a critic. It's easy to tear down a tree. It's very hard to put something in its place. And when it comes to belief systems, and I know that postmodernism is very oftentimes the whipping boy of right-wing or conservative or Christian philosophers, theologians, and so on and so forth. And while we may be very good at criticizing that, there are some critiques that come out from this era that are worth considering. Where I'm trying to address it, and where I think it's impacting our culture, I'm talking about the gun culture right now. Where I think it's impacting the gun culture right now is quite frankly that people are invested in firearms ownership, no matter how they get involved in it, whether they're inspired through video games like Halo or Call of Duty or whatever, whether they saw the item as sort of a modern rendition of the medieval sword that carries some sort of power and responsibility, or whether or not they saw themselves as responsible to their community. The things that keep people tied in is that they believe in something, and especially that they either have a duty to somebody else, or they have a duty to their environment or their community. And so if you predicate your moral philosophy, if you build your foundation on anyone can believe whatever they want, you then get to believe whatever you want, but none of it means anything. That's the consequence. The consequence of postmodernism was we saw that rationalism as the core concept, because rationalism was replaced with authenticity. Before the mechanism of belief was the paradigm of belief was focused on authenticity. It was on rational. What it means to really believe something is that you could correlate it to reality and rationalize it. Well, or maybe not correlate, but it could be rationally arrived at. Then we realized that, well, maybe we didn't realize, but rationalism failed mankind. It wasn't enough to stop World War I. It wasn't the rationalism produced great death in the world, like the French Revolution. And so postmodernism didn't exactly come out of a vacuum. And it doesn't, just because postmodernism isn't right, doesn't mean what it was post about is also correct. But we're able to critique it and look at our society and ourselves and the way that we live our life and realize that, like, this worldview doesn't, not only does it not work, but it ends in that nihilistic death. And that is not only that, though, is it's also not really true. We don't really live like that. As if you're to look at the actions of mankind as evidence of a inherent system within them, religion would be one of the most guaranteed things that you would focus on. And postmodernism isn't necessarily anti-religious, but postmodernism produces the religion of the self and the state, and thus it will open the doors for communism, and it opened the doors for these great genocides and destruction across the West. And so I think that people buy a gun, learn how to use it, because they believe that they have some moral responsibility. They have some moral responsibility. The fact that you own a firearm is itself a bulwark against something like this manifesting more expressly. Whether you train enough is not the point. There is some levels of skill, but these things that we care about come from somewhere. They don't come from a void, and thus how we think about the world.
So here's a question: if I could play devil's advocate for a minute, postmodernism just is this blob of cosmic mucus. Everything is equally valid. People who think that through realize, oh, that's no way to live, and it's not a good answer. But there are other non-subjective worldviews out there that you could run towards. And neo-paganism is a little bit too comic book, but you've probably known Buddhists who are actual true believers, not just trendy California Buddhists, but real ones. I imagine that in Afghanistan, you have met Muslims who would die for their faith. Why is it that the folks that we know and are watching tend toward Christianity and not some of these other less goofy religions?
So, I think you can address some of that in history. During the Ottoman Empire, and if I remember this correctly, during the Ottoman Empire, there was a bit of a caste system established across society. There were the people of the book, and then there were the lesser peoples. And atheists and pagans belonged in the lower population, whereas Christians, Jews, I'm not going to really get into that one, but Christians or people of the book were kind of this middle caste, not necessarily the middle class, but then, of course, ruling powers were all established by Muslims at the time. So if you're asking the question of why Christianity over other religions, I want to make sure I build it off of an argument that throughout history, we've seen multiple examples about how many belief systems just aren't that, they're not very, what do you call it? They're not very real, is probably the best way to say it. And so this is not a new time in life. It's just a different one. So let's start. I think there's really only a small handful of strongly held, perhaps somewhat legitimate belief systems, but I don't necessarily think that they're true. And that would be Christianity, Islam, which I think is just a distortion of Christianity. And then there's, which is funny because it accuses Christianity of being a distortion of itself, and you're like, okay, fine. And then there's Hinduism, and then Eastern Buddhism. But I think what you have in all of these systems is In order for you to look at any other belief system other than Christianity, you must take the identity of God and subtract something. Allah is God without mercy. Nirvana is God without person. And then Buddhism is something almost itself. It's sort of kind of treats the self sort of like a goddish kind of thing. I'm not going to speak too hardcore to its theology, but what you get there is you get Islam is God without moral character in regards to his mercy and his absolutely, depending on which form of Islam. Given I've had conversations with Muslims who believe that God can't see the world on Thursday, and we've all had conversations with Christians who are not exactly theologically solid. We're not gonna do low hanging fruit here, and so there's if you want to look at it from an evidentiary standpoint, the New Testament is the most reliable document that has existed in the world. It is the most consistent and reliable document if you were to look at it from an evidentiary standpoint. I'm going to try to get my numbers again correctly. And we all have read, or many of us have read the Iliad. And many of us have read the Iliad and know that it is a classic Greek tale. The New Testament has an estimate of, which was written in Greek, the New Testament has an estimate of about 50,000 manuscripts that have been found that lead, and those vary from full books to fragments and paragraphs. Those 50,000 manuscripts, if you look at the summary of differences between those, they will come up to a grammatical error, a word written twice, a line written twice, or a comma in the wrong place. There are no places where you have these wildly dramatic changes in theology to some places. And so you have 50,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, of a book that's remained effectively the same for 50,000 years. I'm sorry, not 50,000 years, for 2,000 years. On top, if you take the Iliad, which isn't really challenged as being legitimate, most people accept that Homer wrote the Iliad or something like that. There are 3 manuscripts of the Iliad. 3. You have 50,000 and 3. So the question is always a challenging question, because if you're going to talk about faith, how are you approaching it? Are we approaching it from an evidentiary standpoint? Thomas Aquinas. Are we talking about a wager? It is better to be wrong about heaven but still believe in it than it is to be wrong about heaven not existing and not believe in it. Pascal's wager. So you can come from a rational argument. You can come from an emotional argument. You can come from a historical argument. So there's all these different ways that you can approach it. And I think I go back to somebody like Taylor and in this argument of secularism, is that ultimately I believe in Christianity because it is the only thing that assuages it's the only thing that assuages my soul. Is probably the only way I'm trying to find a better way to say it, but it's just it is the only thing that provides a moral system. It is what we are created to do. So some days it is a rational argument. Some days it is a faith-based argument. But so it's not exactly. I'm not trying to answer the question in the way that I'm trying to convince somebody. Yeah. Because, in some ways, I'm a bit of a Calvinist in that sense, but a bit.
Yeah. What was interesting? So if I have the timing right, this episode should come right after one talking to Brandon Wambo, who has a somewhat similar story to yours, in that he was part of MARSOC and struggled a little bit as he got out of the Marine Corps with, what was it all for? And the difference is he came to his faith through that process, whereas you had familiarity with Christianity before, like I have. But what's interesting is we had a similar conversation that we were having, but it was extremely personal. It was just about his testimony, and it is an incredibly personal thing of just suddenly realizing I need to read the Bible, and partway through the Bible, this is true. like, oh, this is
Mhm.
true. So it's really interesting, I think, to have this conversation from sort of two sides, the cultural and philosophical. Why are these other systems failing? Why are people struggling with these things? And then the direct personal conversation with a guy who says, this is what was on my heart. This is what was on my mind. This is what happened. And he is also, by the way, now a Calvinist. Reading the Bible do that to you, in my experience. So one of the things that is interesting is that all the different ways in which I believe that Christianity holds up. All of these other religions, I understand the appeal of all of them, but they don't hold up to close scrutiny, particularly in different times in history and different cultures. If you come from a certain culture, Hinduism will hold up to what feels like more scrutiny to you. If you come from a different culture, there's immediately things that rub you the wrong way, and so forth.
We can go.
Christianity is a universal this way.
Yep. We can go straight down the Smithsonian path and say that reading and being on time is just cultural whiteness. And if you want to live in that morass of destroying everything, then do it somewhere else. That's fine. If you want to destroy everything, there's countries that are built on that premise. You can go live there. So for myself, I'd say for myself in Christianity, I was born and raised in a Christian home, something I'm very thankful for. There was a time where I kind of took a prodigal route. It's not the prodigal route that you would have from, say, a lack of belief, but an apathy towards it. I knew that God was real, or I believed in something like God, but it didn't really matter to me because I wanted to have my cake and eat it too. And that is a great way to destroy your identity, your personhood. It was not a good time. But the thing that kind of brings this thing together is that, yeah, you can nitpick components of Christianity to challenge it. And you'll see people do this online all the time. Or so they'll say, well, this verse contradicts this verse, or they'll bring up another comic book and a comic book explanation of the world, which is the Da Vinci Code, and be like, oh, a whole bunch of white men got together and described what the Bible was. It's like, you have no idea about history. I'm sorry, you're just illiterate. Like, I don't mean to, you probably shouldn't vote. You probably shouldn't do anything until you've read maybe 80 books, until maybe someone can confirm you're literate. But right now, you're just a fool. You literally read a comic book and says, this is legitimate. It's like, okay, cool, fine. You're broken. But that's me being a little crass. The point on that is there's the Christianity as a worldview. If we're going to scale back, and we're going to scale back to something that not only explains that the world is regular, or confirms that the world is regular, but how it is regular, how you can rely on certain things, how something like an identity or intellect could exist. The presence of the intellect, the idea that you can think about things, implies a creator. So if you keep looking at the world, if you keep looking at the world as a reality, not as something created to worship yourself, you will have to come to the conclusion that it's not only none of this could exist, it's that none of this really does exist outside of the action and the direction and the motivations of a single divine God. If you look at religion as something that isn't just an organization of certain ideas into a social group, but rather the thing which informs you about morality itself, you'll realize that you have to be religious. There's no way about it. Just most people's religion is just themselves, and their philosophy is thus navel gazing.
So. Yeah, and you find inconsistencies in people pretty easily. So that is something that I think also really quickly moves you, kind of funnels you toward Christianity. I think if people are really, really searching for consistency, sure, there's a bunch of denominations. There's a bunch of Christians who are not systematic in their theology. There's a bunch of different trends throughout history of the church, and yet there is an underlying consistency that you can find in Christianity over a longer period of time than Hinduism. And so even people who are coming at it from that perspective, who are just looking for an anchor, I think that is part of the reason that we see people coming back to it. And it certainly doesn't hurt that it has such a long track record culturally.
Mm-hmm.
It is something where like, oh, we're trying these new ideas and they don't work. What are the old ideas? Almost everywhere on the planet, Christianity is one of the old ideas. The gospel has spread so far across the globe that almost everywhere Christianity is one of the old ideas that you can go back to wherever you're at.
Yeah, it's not only that it provides an explanation. I remember sitting and listening to a professor talk about like it sounds annoying, but it's like, what is an explanation? Is it a proper rationalization of a certain whatever? And what is the difference between like an explanation and something else? And like, okay, this is exhausting. And then sure enough, 2 years later, you're like, actually, no, now that makes sense. I wasn't paying attention. But the point in that one is, and I want to turn this actually into a bit of a practical conversation, is that,
Yeah.
This it's not convincing at first, but it might make sense. One of the things that we observed, or at least I observed within the framework of warfare, is that you have to ask yourself, well, maybe you don't have to. People who have no skin in the game frequently like to opine about why men go off to war. Okay, that's fine. I'm not here to criticize you any more than you already do yourself. But in warfare, you ask your JSOC guys, you ask your dudes ask them like, would you rather work a 9 to 5 or go on another deployment? They'll tell you a deployment every day. Why? Deployments are there's something about it, which is you have a sense of purpose and direction. Maybe that's just to survive the deployment. But you have people coming home from the war, and one of the major injuries of the global war on terror is PTSD, which in my undergraduate I oftentimes question whether it was legitimate to begin with, which can sound a little cruel, but PTSD particularly constitutes two different sides. There's the physiological element, damages to the brain, chemical imbalances, your ability to impulse control. This is all you can damage somebody's ability to have impulse control by damaging the brain, traumatic brain injuries, and so on and so forth. I mean, you can impact a person's actions and how they make decisions by damaging the brain. But then there's the second side. So there's the physical side of PTSD and the physiological side, and then the other side is the moral injury side, which ultimately, from the direction that I'm approaching it, is much, much more interesting. Particularly because moral injuries come in one of two forms. Typically, but we'll use two major ones. Somebody witnesses something that they believe that they're responsible for stopping, but they didn't, or they couldn't for whatever reason, and they feel that they're responsible for that. Survivor's guilt. Your job is to stand watch for whatever mean. You're the watchman on the wall. This is a bad metaphor, but it's a metaphor. You're the watchman on the wall. You smell someone baking cookies or whatever it is inside the camp or whatever, and you call your buddy and you say, "Hey, buddy, can you hold my spot here for 5 minutes? I'm going to run over and get one of those while they're hot." In the 5 minutes that you're away, a shot rings out and a sniper had been watching the tower, and now your buddy's dead because you were too weak to stand there 5 more minutes or something. It should have been me. It should have been me. That's one form of moral injury. Another one is that you participate in an atrocity, my lie. You're amongst a group of men who all decide, or some of them decide, or the commander decides that you're going to go do some evil war crime, not just some like CNN, MSNBC, oh, I want a Pulitzer Prize war crime, but like a legitimate war crime. And you know that it's wrong, and you desire, and you don't want to do it, but you go along with it because you don't want to be ostracized by your team. Both of those are examples of moral injury. And those who do not have systems, those who, I believe that one of the reasons why there's so much PTSD in our generation, in my generation, is because men approached war with a worldview. They believed that morality was relative until it was in front of them. And suddenly then, when they had to make life or death decisions, they were being forced to now construct entire moral systems, not ex nihilo, but in front of them. And this led to traumatic injury. And then they returned to a country which tried to reinforce the idea that morality to them was relative. So they're supposed to go fight evil, but evil doesn't exist. It's just a perspective. But it's not a perspective when it happens to you, but it is a perspective when it happens to somebody else that you can sympathize with for the sake of giving my corporation $3 billion or whatever. It's this issue with faith and moral injury and why this level is all attached. And I know, again, I don't think we're doing this. I hope I'm not derailing anyone on this one, but is that
no, I actually see this as a perfect place to wrap up this conversation. So keep going.
Good. So the point therein is the observation of morality and the lack of moral systems, or people going to do serious things with an unserious worldview, that it's relative or it's subjective or whatever, are the ones who are going to suffer the most. And I don't want them to suffer. If you're going to go to war, you better have a belief about what is right and wrong, because you will be held to a standard even if you don't think it's legitimate. And what I believe is the most legitimate moral standard is that morality comes from the mouth of God. And those who went to war with faith were substantially less impacted by what we are now referring to as PTSD, because they could look at a man, say he is a man, know that that man is doing something evil that warrants death, and use a rifle and shoot him, whatever you want to call it. So that reflects into the gun culture. We chide each other. We ride on each other all the time for, oh, you're not practicing enough. You're not going to the gym enough. You're letting your gear get sloppy. It's like, yes, you can have the perfect gear. You can be in amazing shape. You can have all the training in the world. But if you lack the moral fiber to do the work, then you are nothing. You are nothing more than just another would-be war leader in creating another Somalia 2.0, and somebody will eventually recognize that you are the bad guy of the story.
So this concept of moral injury is, I think, really important. So there are, in the past, ways that people have been controlled or manipulated or turned to other sides, often involves a moral compromise. And sometimes it's just because of the blackmail possibility. Like, we have compromised you and we have footage of it, so now you belong to us. But a lot of times I think it is the moral injury itself, like the fact that this person's character has been compromised, like a torn ACL, like they just don't have a leg to stand on anymore. Like, they know that they're damaged goods. That is actually the control mechanism, or that is actually more than the blackmail material is the thing. Mm-hmm. And so what I feel like is another answer, and maybe the ultimate answer to why people were turning to Christianity in the midst of this postmodernism crisis. It's partly that there's a lack of structure, but a lot of other possible religions can offer you structure. But Christianity is the only one that offers forgiveness for these moral injuries. And that is something that is, I think, pretty inescapable. Like the salvation in Islam is not true redemption. It's almost like a loophole. But the salvation inside of Christianity is actual redemption, and the wrong is actually made right. And it's not just waved away, but it's actually paid for. And I think that resonates with the God-shaped hole inside of the person, or the conscience, or the scar tissue on their moral injury, in a way that nothing else actually can. So you can find structure in these other things, and you can find, new ways of defining meaning. But when people are hopeless, there is only one religion that truly offers hope. Mm-hmm. And I think that is encouraging if we want people to find Christianity. But in some ways, it's a little discouraging that that's the state that we're at. That's the position that we're at now. It's not just that we've experimented with some different things, and we just like, oh, this was a dumb idea. We'll find our way back. It's like, no, people are legitimately broken, hurting, hopeless, desperate to find the truth. But the good news is that it's there.
Yeah, I mean, to those who are like to the way that you can look at it and hope. When Christ said in the New Testament, he's like, take up your cross and follow me. You must die to yourself. Not all dying to oneself is painful. Well, maybe it's painful, but maybe maybe the thing that you have to bring to the cross, that you need to bring to the altar, is that sense of guilt, is that moral injury. I need to give the moral injury oftentimes manifests as a person's identity. You see this in examples of like hyper awareness, like I have to be aware all the time. Like they've turned it into their person. Let that go. Put it on the cross. Bring it to the altar. That, and for some people it might just be arrogance that needs to go too. But the point with that is, and for those who are Christians, we can look back into the Old Testament and look at the kind of faith God demands of his people, that he requires of them, and that faithlessness in the face of adversity is not really treated any less than faithlessness in the face of opulence. They're very similar. But to those of us who are saying, to those who are Christians, who are looking out into the world and saying, I'm alone, there's nobody like me, this world is falling apart, the America, whatever, pick your phrase, your kind of temporary black pill moment. And remember that the faith that God calls people to is a faith that sustains and withstands the storm. It's not that the storm is coming. It's not that the hard times are in a year. It's not that we're going to sit here in our basements and prepare for whatever sort of post-apocalyptic worldview or world that we ever want to create. The hard times, I think, are right now. We are watching them unfold before our very eyes. You have people. What are some examples of moral injuries that people are encountering on a daily basis in the United States? We are told to turn a blind eye from the open human trafficking that the U.S. government is participating with on the southern border, while being lectured by literal racists that not protecting people from being human trafficked is actually considered slavery. These slave keepers are telling you that you're the problem. That's one example, right? There you have issues with the southern border. The people who are telling you about your health are lecturing you about your health, and they barely can make it up a flight of stairs. Or their example of being healthy is to whatever, right? It's to follow the system, obey the rules, get in line, shut your mind off. Do what the experts tell you. Worship me. Affirm me. The people who are lecturing us about sexual morality are destroying people's lives and bodies. These are all examples of things that can be understood as moral injuries. And so as we go forward, we should be if you look out into the world and you say that it's dark and it's terrible, yeah, have faith. Carry on. And so that is the core.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to end the episode. We, all of us, even those of us who didn't go to Afghanistan, have at times participated in things that were fruitless, pointless, have adopted, have made mistakes and have even been morally injured. But perseverance, there's so much value in actual perseverance in the face of the hard times when you have an actual hope. So I think that it is fascinating to see the changes that we've seen culturally over the last few decades. I would love to keep unpacking this can of worms and pull some different threads out, but it's already been an hour. I don't want to take too much of your time because you have your own podcast that you've got to work on, and then this house is actually going to get very loud in about 10 minutes. So I want to thank you for being on the show. I also want to thank you for the work that you're doing with your podcast. The folks that you've had on and some of the different discussions that you've had, I think are really helpful for the wider community. So is there anything in particular that you want to specifically plug, or how do you like people to consume your podcast? Is it on YouTube? Is it on Spotify? Where should they go to look you up?
Yep. So the fastest way to get a hold of me is on Instagram. You can get a hold of me at redacted LLC. That's Instagram for direct messaging. I'm still small enough that I can answer my own emails or whatever. If you want to follow the podcast, the podcast is available on Spotify and Apple and those kinds of platforms, as well as on YouTube and Rumble. On YouTube and Rumble, Redacted Culture Cast. You can look at there, or you can head over to my website at redactedllc.com. So that's redacted, REDACTED. Redacted as in like, well, we have privacy and property, and this is where those things come together. The Second Amendment is a piece of paper with some writing on it. That's not the important thing. The important thing is the ideas that created that and why they thought it was important enough to enshrine it into our Constitution. Because if the people of the United States do not believe that that is true, then they will not act as if it is true, and then it will not have the strength that it requires for it to be functional. But yeah, Redacted LLC and the Redacted Culture Cast.
Fantastic. Well, I recommend that people listen. You have some fantastic guests on there. I need to actually. The good news is I'm on a road trip, so I can get caught up on a couple of episodes, because you had some people on a while back that I was like, oh, I definitely need to hear that. And it would have been nice if I listened to it today before this conversation, because I could have referred back to some stuff. But I really enjoyed the topic that you brought today, and I really enjoyed our conversations. I enjoy our offline conversations, but the online ones are also interesting and fun. It's kind of interesting. I'm still wrapping my mind around the podcast game, to have a two-person conversation and still kind of think about the third chair in the conversation. I'm gradually getting to where I like it. Yeah.
It's like, oh, are you having conversations behind my back? Is that cheating on me? So
it's a very strange thing. Yeah,
it is. But Isaac, thank you very, very much for what you've done and what you're doing over there at T-Rex Arms. I know that there's plenty of criticism and rage that goes around the firearms industry, and there's plenty of people who build their identity on not being somebody else. You know what? Fine. If that's who you are, you can stay in the second seat. But Isaac, I've enjoyed this conversation. I look forward to what's coming out with you guys, and one of those conversations that we'll have offline.
Oh yeah, we've had some. I mean, this conversation got a little deep, but we've had some interesting conversations offline about the dangers of black pilling and stuff. So yeah, we'll continue to have these conversations, and those of you who are listening to the podcast, continue to have these conversations. I enjoy the opportunity to meet guys like Forrest in real life and have him on the podcast, and he's a, I have to say, it's weird talking about you in the third person while you're here and the listener is not here, but you have some fascinating conversations and insights. But the opportunity that the listener has to have these kinds of conversations with people in real life, face-to-face, with their actual friends, with their actual neighbors, the people they have relationships with, should not be neglected. Don't get all of your thoughts and all of your iron sharpening iron from podcast people. Actual face-to-face stuff matters. So Thank you so much, Forrest, for the face-to-face stuff that we've been able to do, but also for the podcast thing. I appreciate it.
All right. We'll talk to you later.